Good morning. My name is Sofia Barbarani. I will be moderating this panel this morning on terrorism in the time of coronavirus. We're being hosted by the Eurogulf Information Center in Rome. And well, it seems we have a pretty large audience this morning, so thank you very much for attending. Just a few points before I begin. If you have any questions, we're going to get to Q&As later. If you want to send them over, you'll see that there is a button on the bottom of your screen for Q&As, so please send them there rather than on the chat window, because that just gets a little bit messy. So we have, like I said, we're over 150 viewers, so thank you very much for joining us. And let me start. So we have a great panel of, we have 4 speakers this morning, as you'll see in your Zoom windows. We've got Jan St. Pierre. He's speaking to us from Germany. It's very international. Caroline Vereen, she's speaking to us from London. Peter R. Newman, also from Germany. And then Mitchell Balfour, who is speaking to us. He's joining from my lovely hometown of Rome, Italy. So coronavirus. As I'm sure all of you viewers know, it's our biggest health crisis and has been for the past few months. According to the World Health Organization, we've seen hundreds of thousands of confirmed cases, of documented cases throughout the globe, and tens of thousands of deaths. A stunted economic situation, social discontent. But there is another side to it, which is what we'll be talking about today. What about terrorist organizations in the time of coronavirus? So like in most crises, experts have warned that the virus could cause a risk to social order and could also be weaponized by some terrorist organizations. They've also said that it could deter other terrorist organizations. As I'm sure you've all heard, there was a recent ISIS newsletter where they warned their members against traveling to Europe. They also warned them against coming or leaving countries with the virus. Some experts have also said that they fear this self-isolation and how long it will be going on for, fearing that some susceptible individuals might fall down terrorist rabbit holes, for example. Let me just briefly outline what we're going to be covering today, and then I'll introduce you to our great speakers. First of all, like I said, how does the coronavirus affect terrorist groups throughout the globe? How are these terrorist organizations adapting to the virus? What are some of the ways that they're exploiting the virus? What can we expect from the future? Will there be a spike in extremism as a result of the virus? And what will be the long-term impacts? So I've already introduced you to our speakers. Let me just briefly give a little bit of background on them, and then I'll let them take it away. So we've got Jan St. Pierre. He is CEO and counterterrorism advisor for Modern Security Consulting Group. And like I said, he's in Berlin, Germany. Welcome. Caroline Vereen, senior lecturer in security and international organization at Regent's University, London. She's also the director and co-founder of Professors Without Borders. Peter R. Newman, senior fellow, International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence, also in Germany. And finally, our host, Mitchell Balfour, who is the president of the Eurogulf Information Center. So I'd like to start with Jan in Berlin, if you'd like to just briefly introduce yourself to our viewers and then take it away.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Nice of you to tune in. I know we have a lot of competing web events, but it's nice for you to actually take the time to join us today. I live in Berlin. The company is in Berlin, but I'm actually from the other side of the Atlantic. I'm from Montreal, so I'm from Canada, which makes this panel even more international, which is fun. Probably I get a migrant perspective to this as well, even if my skin color doesn't necessarily fit the prejudice that is often linked to migration. My specialty is terrorism, and I've been working on this, like my colleagues, for a very long time, prior to 9/11. And it's been very interesting to monitor how this pandemic has affected not only the terrorist environments, but also the extremist environments. And I'd like to focus on a bit more general. I know how my colleagues will go deeper perhaps in certain aspects, but what I'd like to focus on is on the validation aspect of the current crisis and the opportunity aspect of it for extremist and terrorist groups as well. The first part with validation is that pandemics, historically, they always have this religious, metaphysical feeling to it. You think about the wrath of God at some point punishing certain armies or certain people for sinful lives. You see it as God's intervention very often. And this is exactly the depiction that a lot of extremist religious-based organizations are having, whether it's ISIS, as it was mentioned earlier, where they say, well, the virus is a soldier of God. You have the same thing from Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. They'll mention the same thing. And then on the flip side, you'll have Christian organizations, especially in the United States, that will also view this as the work of God, and even in certain cases as actually support for Donald Trump. And in both ways, this is God's will. It's a test for the times. It's a way to react, and this creates again, in terms to metaphysics, you see, for example, left-wing or far-left groups, they see in the spread of the virus a vindication of the abuses and inequalities of globalization, of neoliberalism, of capitalism. And so for them, this is another form of validation, seeing it's not necessarily a "we told you so," but it's more of a look around you, you can see the system is unequal, and it's actually fostering, again, more suffering. It's creating more divisions within our societies. This is an example of it. And then you have, of course, far-right groups who also view this as an opportunity on various levels. The first one, of course, being it's a foreign virus. That is, it seems to confirm the fact that threats always come from outside, and there's a way, if you shut down borders, if you prevent foreigners from coming in, that it somehow protect the nation. There's also the aspect that, especially through conspiracy theories, that the deep state is involved. So we're talking about larger conspiracies that somehow the virus is produced in a lab somewhere and designed to target very specific groups, to make sure that that certain, let's say, Jewish groups or certain organizations and so on and so forth are behind this to try to destabilize the societies. And when we come, that's the validation part. And so in every way, basically extremist groups find a way to see what they want to see in this virus is essentially a confirmation of their positions. In terms of opportunity, of course, we see, you mentioned earlier, the call to arms of ISIS saying, well, you can use this as an opportunity to spread more chaos, just be careful. Same thing with Al-Qaeda. Far left groups are calling for plundering, saying, look, if we can exacerbate and bring awareness to populations that the system is unjust and unequal, maybe we can actually start a new system. And then from the far right perspective, you have the same thing, whether it's accelerationists or saying change, the current system doesn't work, we need to provoke that. But what's very interesting with the far right is perhaps there's more talk about the weaponization of that virus than in any other circles. The far right and a lot of these groups have been linked to more coughing attacks, for lack of a better term, deliberately coughing on individuals or certain groups to try to infect them. So we're seeing, again, the opportunity is there for a lot of these groups. They're trying to use it. I think right now what we're seeing is really a convergence or coalescence of both the justification morally for them, their positions, as well as an opportunity to strike.
Thank you very much, Jan. That's really interesting. I wonder whether there have been actual instances of an increase in anti-Semitism as a result of these sort of extremist organizations in certain countries. I read a few reports recently, but I don't know if, for example, in Germany, you guys have been seeing this as a spike in anti-Semitism as a result of the virus. Is that something that's happening?
Well, it's definitely a concern, but the fact that there was previously a spike, over the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years, whether it's due to the virus or just the natural momentum of the last few years, it's hard to tell right now. But there's definitely, a more interest for conspiracy theories, and a lot of them, of course, with the deep state being related to perhaps Jewish money for the way they express it, could relate to more anti-Semitism. But right now, it's hard to see if there's really an impact on this side.
Right. It's too early to tell, I would think. Okay, Jan, I'm going to get back to you later with a few more questions. Let me just go on to Caroline now from London. Like I said earlier, Caroline is joining us from London, and she is a senior lecturer in security and international organizations at Regent's University. Caroline, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you everybody for joining us. My area of specialization has been violent non-state actors, specifically in Africa, but of course they don't operate in a vacuum, and they're interrelated with a lot of other non-state actors in other countries. So I guess when understanding or discussing the effect of coronavirus on terrorism, you've got to also distinguish by region. Where are they having where is this having an effect, and how does the effect in one country differ from in another country? So I'm going to start by discussing my perceptions of the impact on African terrorist groups, and then perhaps more generally how I think it's going to shape terrorism around the globe. So completely agree with Jan. I think for a lot of people, and not just for terrorist groups, there is a feeling that this is the West and the globalized world getting its just desserts for all the inequality and environmental damage and excesses that we have seen over the last, definitely over the last century. So I think on one angle, this could lead to encouraging people to take action or to want to participate in the reaction. But on another, there's also other individuals are going to feel, well, this is happening, people are getting the just desserts, and just watch and enjoy. So it's not just necessarily going to probe the same people in the same direction. In the case of a lot of terrorist groups, not just in Africa, but specifically so, there is also the fear of contagion. Not every terrorist is a suicide terrorist. They don't want to get sick, they don't want their families to get sick, and they realize the weakness of their health systems. So there is a natural instinct to protect your community, and we saw this with the first communique from ISIS. Don't travel to these regions, don't get sick, and certainly don't bring it back to us. And the fear of contagion is multifaceted. So obviously you don't want to get sick, you don't trust the health systems if you do, but there's also a memory of relationships, existing relationships also, with doctors and with MSF in these regions. MSF has been one of the only organizations who's had access, continuing access, to a lot of these violent non-state actors. So there's a high degree of respect, I think, compared to any other actors for doctors, for medical workers, and a high degree of fear that this is a disease that's going to really destroy a lot of communities, a lot of families, and nobody wants to be faced with that. So I know there's been reports of perhaps hospitals being targeted. I don't personally see that as being the highest level of threat for the reasons I mentioned. So in some areas, wanting to seclude yourself and isolate yourself, and others, it's still a certain amount of respect for the medical profession. Perhaps I'm being optimistic about it, but the existing relationship between MSF and a lot of violent non-state actors is still quite strong, and they need to keep that strong because there's a contagion going around. Now, in terms of global sentiment, well, we've seen, obviously the numbers of travelers has gone down. We've seen in organized crime, there's been a reduction in trafficking of most things because of travel, because of increasing control. So financing for a lot of organized criminals who have links to violent non-state actors has also been affected. And so you've got to balance that out. Is there really an opportunity for for any attacks right now when there is a reduction in capacity and an increase in controls? As I said, I'm not completely convinced that hospitals are that opportunity. I think critical infrastructure, perhaps a bigger target, which would have an even bigger impact. And we've got to wonder whether those are being properly guarded everywhere that they need to be. My biggest concern right now is actually the post-crisis situation. We are going to be facing an incredibly severe economic crisis. We already see very high levels of unemployment, specifically youth unemployment. And this is breeding resentment. You can talk about people being bored and online and being radicalized as much as you like. Even those who are not are going to be facing a future which is beyond their control, which is being created by politicians. And that's creating a very significant generational divide. And I'm very worried about that generational divide. The rise in unemployment, the critical economic crisis, compounded with boredom, compounded with with this feeling that who is making the sacrifice and for whom, is one that's I think could lead to more radicalization and more empowerment of individuals and violent non-state actors at the end of this crisis. And I think the longer it lasts, the longer the lockdown lasts, the longer the epidemic lasts, the more likely we are to see severe economic consequences and opportunities for radicalization among the younger generations.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was very interesting. You mentioned non-state actors as well as terror organizations, and I wonder, this might be a bit of a crazy question, but it just popped into my mind. Is there any chance that this virus could somehow be weaponized against these non-state groups and terror organizations? And I don't mean necessarily directly using the virus, but somehow using the situation against these groups.
Well, I think they are probably more vulnerable than people who are part of organized society, because a lot of these violent non-state groups, especially in Africa, are already on the margins of society with very limited healthcare, in close proximity. You could liken it to a refugee camp where we already are afraid of having major outbreaks. But even if they did have an impact in terms of health, the mortality rates are probably not such that it would completely decimate any of the violent non-state actor groups that I'm thinking about. Could affect the leadership, but as we've seen, there are plenty of people in the background who are happy to take over. I can think of a couple of leaders who would, who are probably propping up their group, and without them, it could create the end of the group. We've seen that in some VNSAs, kind of like the decapitation policy. I still think it would be a temporary decimation if it were to happen, because of the opportunity for recruitment, which is going to be opening up with the economic crisis.
Right, of course. All right, Caroline, thank you very much. And I'll also come back to you later with a few more questions before the Q&A. Let's move on to our third speaker, also from Germany, Peter Newman. Hi, Peter. Peter is a senior fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence. And please go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you for having me participate in this interesting new format. I don't really have that much to add to what Caroline said, which kind of more or less reflected what I was thinking. For the time being, I think for existing terrorist groups, for existing extremist organizations, this is, for the time being, a bad moment. It is a distraction. If you think that terrorism is about creating terror, it is about generating attention, it is about manipulating our minds through fear, it is about having an audience. Right now, terrorist groups do not have an audience. No one is paying attention. And there's no fear of terrorism because there's fear of something else. Something else is generating far more fear, far more effectively than any terrorist could at this point. So in that sense, it's a bad moment for terrorists who are relying on terror and attention in order to achieve their objectives. In a sense, we are kind of testing the theory that used to be around for a very long time, that if only we stopped paying attention to terrorism, terrorism would go away. Now is the time where we've all stopped paying attention to terrorism. Let's see what happens to terrorism, because right now they don't have, if you want, the fertile publicity ground on which to make their actions effective. And yes, there is a little bit of activity. We've all read the articles about right-wing extremists trying to experiment with stuff. We've all seen the reports about ISIS's statement. I do think that, of course, this will lead inevitably in the future at some point to more experimentation with biological weapons and viruses by terrorists. How successful is another question. But for the time being, there isn't a lot of activity. I'm sorry, this is the dishwasher in my background in case you hear strange noises. But for the time being, there's not a lot of activity. What I'm more concerned about, like Caroline, are the consequences, the long-term or medium-term consequences in economic and political terms. There's no debate anymore about the fact that this will lead to a recession possibly greater than any recession since the Great Recession of the 1920s. The question is not whether there will be a recession. The question is exactly how great the recession will be. And this will, of course, lead to turmoil. For understandable reasons, we are very much focused on Italy right now. But if you look beyond Europe, if you look at countries that are not necessarily directly affected by the virus, they will suffer also from the economic consequences that are generated by the virus. And these are countries that even before the virus, in a relatively benign economic atmosphere, were already struggling to contain the discontent of their young populations. And now, with the economy essentially coming to a standstill, you can easily see how this will generate more instability, more polarization, more cleavages and tensions within societies, and all of that without necessarily presuming any automatic translation into violence. But this provides a fertile ground that terrorists can take advantage of. Just look at North Africa, look at even the Gulf countries, and look at what is happening with the current oil price and the fact that they will not be able to generate enough money for the foreseeable future to pay for their budget. So I do think that over the next 1 or 2 or 3 or even 5 or 10 years, we will struggle and be preoccupied, not necessarily with the virus. The virus will at some point hopefully be contained, but we will struggle with the economic and political consequences generated by the period of standstill that we're currently experiencing. And that, in a sense, will be a fertile ground for terrorists of all stripes, whether jihadists, right-wing terrorists, or other kinds of terrorism will find opportunities to exploit in years to come.
Okay, sorry, just unmuting. Thank you very much, Peter. So you mentioned long-term consequences, and I wonder, I mean, the thing that comes to mind to me as someone who has primarily worked in Iraq and Syria is, you know, ISIS was able to rise to power during a time, a very vulnerable time for both countries. Could this virus, which is exacerbated by things like the economy and a very fragile political situation in Iraq, for example, could this potentially lead to ISIS taking the opportunity to rise again, given how fragile and delicate the country is at this moment, particularly in Iraq?
I think all sorts of scenarios are possible as we are moving forward. I think we have to look at how likely they are. And I think I just wanted to add also, since you gave me the opportunity, that it's not like a downturn in the economy will automatically produce extremism or terrorism. I don't think it's that simple. If it was that simple, then of course we would see a lot more terrorism in a lot more countries. However, what is definitely going to create problems is that the situation in Iraq and Syria will be, I think, is likely that it will be neglected by other countries, that we will stop paying attention to that it will take us way too long to notice that the situation is deteriorating, that perhaps sectarian conflicts are yet again escalating, that the political situation is becoming more unstable, and that there will be even less of an appetite to do anything about it and fewer resources to do anything about it. And so my fear is that as we are increasingly preoccupied with our own countries and with fixing the economic and political consequences of this virus in our own countries, our capacity to actually engage in other countries and to take developing situations in other countries seriously will be diminished. And that will, of course, give groups like ISIS opportunities. If you read the statements from 2 years ago by ISIS, by the then leader of ISIS, he was saying, basically, we're just waiting for the West again to completely withdraw from this region, because like 2010, that will give us another opportunity to come back. I think for reasons that were completely unforeseen by everyone, this may be another moment where the West, but also other parts of the world, are withdrawing, are no longer paying attention, because we're so preoccupied with our own problems, that this will give opportunities for groups like ISIS to come back.
Right. I mean, we've seen it in recent days in Iraq with the withdrawal and reshuffling of US troops from the country. So I would say that it's already beginning, forgetting about Iraq, forgetting about Syria. Okay, Peter, thank you very much for that. And let me introduce our final speaker, Mitchell Balfour, who is joining us from a very quiet Rome. He is the president of the Eurogov Information Center. Hi, Mitchell.
First, hello, everybody. Hello, panel, and hello outside to our viewing audience. I have to say, not only are we coming from many different places, but also our audience is coming really from the four corners of the earth. So I'm very happy to see so many people engaged in this topic. Before into my theme, there's a couple of points I'd like to raise. First, we didn't properly introduce Sophia. Sophia just came back not that long ago from Iraq. where she's been covering, I guess, for many years, the situation in Iraq. And she has also an insider's perspective of what's happening in Iraq, also in relation to coronavirus and the upsurge, I think, of coronavirus cases and the upsurge of kind of in interstate tension. So I look forward also to engaging with our moderator on some of these topics afterwards. For me, I have to say I chose to go last, which now I deeply regret, because my co-panelists have covered such a wide variety of issues that, of course, now I feel a little bit like a jackal or a vulture, just in grabbing what's left. But be that as it may, I decided to name my particular contribution after a film. Everybody thinks of it as a Clint Eastwood film. I like to remember that it was an Italian, Sergio Leone, who came up with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And so my contribution today will be on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. If you don't know the film The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, you can Google it while we're on screen. But the quick end of the plot is that there's a number of competing outlaws. Those outlaws are looking for a particular goal. They want to get rich. They find all kinds of ways to manage that. It's a good cowboy film, what they call a spaghetti film, a spaghetti cowboy film. But if we were to substitute, for example, the goals that these outlaws are looking for with something else, be it state capture or be it exerting more control in their particular theaters, and we substitute our outlaws for a number of terrorist organizations, we can kind of put pieces together. For my contribution, I will look at Hezbollah, I will look at the Houthis or Ansar Allah, and very controversially, I will look at Iran, not necessarily Iran as the country Iran, but as some of the branches of the Iranian state, for example, the IRGC, which is continuing in the coronavirus to produce a narrative, which we will talk about a little bit later. And they have not led up their operations, their global operations or their regional operations. So I would like to spend a little bit of time on that. I know it's controversial. I know that there's a lot of food for thoughts, a lot of debate about to what extent, especially now, we can look at all of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. I have the tendency of looking at them as one unified group and consider them a terrorist organization. But what I would like maybe to start is how I'm going to be dealing with these groups today. I will look at the good, what they're trying to image, the image that they're trying to produce, the bad, what things they're doing in the meantime, and the ugly, what the residue of this is going to look like afterwards. I'd also like to build a little bit on what Peter was saying. I think that it's really true. Now terrorist activities by some of the main groups, they're not going to attract the same attention. This is much larger than any of them. And so there is a kind of reform that's taking place. It's a temporary reform, of course, but they are now struggling to gain through their behavior related to the coronavirus what they couldn't do through their acts of violence in the lead up to it. And here, to be very specific, if we're going to break it down a little bit, for instance, Hezbollah, what they're trying to do in Lebanon, we'll talk about Hezbollah International perhaps later. And I do hope for a lot more questions because this is just a little bit of an overview. But what Hezbollah is trying to do in Lebanon is to use its position in government to show itself to be and I'll put it in inverted commas, to show itself to be a responsible partner in government. It wants to show that it's putting its people out there. There's a lot of, Hezbollah guys, members walking around spraying and disinfecting. They've put a lot of money behind hospitals. They're giving out masks. They're trying to show once again that they are, a social movement, not a terrorist organization. And this is very important and will have larger ramifications, of course, as they're trying to rehabilitate their image not just because of the struggles that they've had in the Gulf, and not just because of their activities in Syria, but for their domestic, the high level of corruption, the mismanagement of government in the years before, in the months before. You had widespread demonstrations, and Hezbollah was in the crosshairs of that. And so they're using that opportunity to rehabilitate themselves also in the eyes of the Lebanese. They are, of course, I mean, there's a lot of criticism of what's, let's say, of how they're distributing the money. Yeah, that of course some of the Shia areas or their people will receive the money first, be that as it may, and nonetheless, the image is a good one. They declared war. This has been quite a fun thread to follow as well. They declared war on the coronavirus, and they look upon it as this kind of struggle, and they're going to be the leaders in this. The Houthi, the Ansar Allah, the Houthi in Yemen, they've done a tremendous job in trying to follow the rules set out by the World Health Organization. So for the first time in probably since they've swept across and taken over Sana'a, they're following an international protocol on what to do with coronavirus. They're calling in experts from the World Health Organization, and they're trying to show themselves that they can be in government. Iran, just to be brief on this, Iran has kind of gone through a variety of different things. They're of course looking for sanctions relief. They're trying to stress the fact that the sanctions relief would go and help their people. They've released prisoners. They're trying to show this kind of being part of a global system combating coronavirus. That's the good. And I put the good in inverted commas because just because this is the image that they're trying to convey doesn't mean that this is the reality behind the movements. And if we start with Hezbollah, what we see is that actually all of this is for show. They're really just strengthening their position. Somebody told me yesterday that actually they're using the coronavirus as a way of redeploying out of Syria. Without much of the fanfare that now they can, legitimately call their people to come back, which is creating, of course, a bubble in Syria of these, in Lebanon of these returning Hezbollah fighters. They are, I think, also not only trying to kind of push more pressure onto activists, because don't forget there had been a big wave of activism against them in the months before coronavirus. So now they're using their strengthened position to go after some of their opponents domestically and strengthen their position in government. For our audience, we should be reminded that terrorist groups make terrible governments. So eventually, whatever gains they have in the government sector now will, quickly be unfolded. But be it as it may, their declaration of war on the coronavirus is also a further mismanagement of the resources that they have at their disposal, because of course it's a sectarian movement, and they are rewarding their people first. The Houthi is just fantastic at double speak, because just as they follow the WHO recommendations, they launch ballistic missiles at Saudi Arabia this week. They're trying to further consolidate their position in Yemen. They've had in the last 2 months, they've had 2 major operations to gain lost territory. So on the grounds, the words and the actions don't match. So we haven't seen that much of a let up actually in Houthi insurgent behavior in Yemen. So it's, and again, they're not necessarily a terrorist organization. They're an insurgency, but they are using from time to time terrorist tactics. So I do bundle them up into this organization. So they are on the ground. The Houthi are not changing their behavior, although the hospitals that they run are doing better and are following the World Health Organization recommendations. Finally, there's Iran, and I'm going to try to link Iran a little bit to the wider Gulf countries, because if you look at especially the cases in Bahrain and the cases in Saudi Arabia, most of them are people who came from Iran. At the beginning, we can't really fault the Iranians for this. Nobody really knew what was happening with the coronavirus, and I don't think that the Iranians deliberately contracted it, but they also didn't take precautions. All of us will remember the Iranian shrine staying open. All of us will remember the way that, you know, people would go there and lick the shrines one after the other after the other. They didn't do very much preemptive action to try to restrain it. But where the problem really begins for the Gulf countries, particularly for Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, is that the Iranians stopped stamping the passports of the citizens that were coming back to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia from Iran. So this is, of course, a violation of diplomatic protocol. You're supposed to stamp the passport coming in and out of the country. And so it's raised fears that actually this is being deliberately done. This is, you know, we've seen a kind of spike in, and it's not just in those countries that I've mentioned, but you see them throughout the region now. You have a lot more cases of people that are being directly related back to Iran. So on the one hand, while the Iranians are trying to brand themselves in this particular case as both a victim of the virus, which they are, sorry, I'm out of practice talking so much. So as the Iranians are trying to brand themselves as a victim of this, they're also not participating, I think, in a kind of international system to try to restrict the movement of the virus. Of course, there's also the campaigns, the disinformation campaigns. They're not the only ones who are. It's about the regions, and we've heard already from Jan about this idea of the West getting their just rewards. You're getting a lot of this discourse out of Iran as well, particularly when it comes to the Gulf countries. And a lot of them are saying, well, this is what happens. This is punishment that's being met out by Allah for you. And so this is very irresponsible, and it even in some ways has raised, you know, eyebrows throughout the Gulf as to what extent Iran is using coronavirus as a form of a biological weapon, as a way of, you know, creating deeper instability in their rival states. So this is something that I think needs to be addressed as well, and I do look forward to the questions. The ugly, I mean, just to ramp this up, the ugly is not what we've seen now. The ugly is, of course, clears us. The ugly is going to be what the residue is like as countries in the region have a little bit of a deeper distrust, even more of a distrust to each other. This was an opportunity, I think, for some countries to have shown a deeper responsibility to one another, and those opportunities are in some ways being skirted. And so I think that it's important for us to put in place an action plan for what comes next, because coronavirus has created this global, it's a global pandemic that's going to have deep political and economic residue afterwards. But, you know, what are we doing about it is the question. And if we don't do anything, so we could expect, you know, brace yourself, because it's going to be an ugly period ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mitchell. I'm wondering, in terms of, you mentioned potential sanction relief for Iran. If this were to happen, I mean, we've seen the U.S. extend the waiver to Iraq to continue importing oil from Iran for another 30 days. And whilst that's not that long, it still gives them some sort of safety net for the coming month. But in terms of Iran, what would it mean for the U.S. And for Trump's administration if they were to agree to a sanctions relief for Iran?
I mean, I didn't have the time to really go into it, but I wanted to maybe underline that the reason why I wanted to include the IRGC in this is because they're essentially the organization that controls the imports and exports into and out of.
Tell our viewers what IRGC.
Sorry, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So Iran's essentially elite military. There's the military, and then there's the IRGC. It's a parallel elites military system. So the IRGC controls everything coming in and out of the country. I don't see sanction relief on the horizon. I also should stress that most medical equipment is not under sanction. You don't have an imposed sanction on these kind of medical equipment. I should also point out that the IRGC at the beginning of the crisis ensured that most masks went to China. Of course, they also didn't plan ahead for themselves. Again, this classic mismanagement. It's not only in Iran. A lot of countries are facing mismanagement problems on this crisis. But in terms of sanctions relief, I think now the Iranians have given too much away, and now they're trying to put the onus on sanctions and say this is the reason why we're facing this problem. In fact, it's not. I think the Americans, in a sign of goodwill, have extended the waiver to Iraq. I think that also when it comes to specific sanctions, you may see that the enforcement would be less in this time of crisis. But again, if the IRGC is not showing itself to be responsible, I don't see that sanctions relief will help anyways. Because just like before the crisis, money wasn't reaching the people of Iran. The money that was coming in was going into the pockets of the IRGC, where it stayed. And so, again, in the lead up to this crisis, there were demonstrations across the country against the IRGC's mismanagement. So we don't want to be in a position where we now put all the responsibility on the coronavirus for what the government in Iran has not done in support of its people. So.
Yeah, I mean, and even so, the government in Iran hadn't done before, and they also have not been doing now, in the sense that when the outbreak first began, like you mentioned, their reaction to it was, I mean, it was barely there, really. There were people still going to shrines on pilgrimage. Only that the difference now is that civilians will have a hard time taking to the street to protest against the situation, clearly. So I would say it's looking pretty bleak for Iran at the moment. All right, well, we've gone through all of our speakers who have made some incredibly interesting points. I would like to now open up to our viewers for some questions to our speakers. I am going to take some questions that are coming in through the Q&A. So again, as I said at the beginning, if you do have any questions, please don't send them in through the chat option at the bottom of your screen, but send them through the Q&A button. And if you could make them as clear and succinct as possible, also send your name and organization, please. Thank you. So we will start off with a question for Caroline. How do you, sorry, give me a second. How do you think that Africa-based groups and their leaders are or might be affected by the virus? And are there any group-specific examples that you could give us? So obviously you already mentioned this earlier. If you could perhaps give us a few more examples of how you think that these groups might be affected, and specifically if you could also give us the name of one or two groups that you think will be the most affected by this virus.
I think it depends on how the groups operate. So for example, if you just look at Boko Haram, you've got two very different modus operandi. One of them is the ISWAP faction, which is more embedded in the community in the Lake Chad region. They're trying to bring services to the community, trying to maintain productivity and tax the community. So if there's an outbreak up there, it's going to have much higher impact on ISWAP's perception and its actual capabilities long term. It will really disrupt their long-term objectives. So I think if the violent non-state actor has an approach which is to safeguard the community, often with an objective to tax the community, then the impact for disruption is much bigger. If you look at Abu Shakau's faction, that's not at all how they operate. If there's an outbreak among the community, it doesn't really change their capabilities or their strategy. However, if their leader, if Shakau, assuming he's alive, he's been killed about 12 times at least, assuming he's alive, if he were to perish from this or anything else, I think it would very much change that organization, which is particularly violent, I think, under the influence of its leader. If you were to move to an organization like Al-Shabaab, it's same thing. I think their role in safeguarding some communities, taxing, trying to legitimize themselves and replace the government, then you have a much higher risk factor of an epidemic for them, in terms of their strategy, the operations, their legitimacy. So I think every single organization and faction, depending on how they operate, would have a different impact. Again, as I mentioned earlier, decapitation, I think, is only going to work in certain types of groups. And I don't think that anybody can safely say that they are immune from the impacts of this virus. So no matter how far you are from the center, this is an epidemic. On the other hand, I will add, for the case of African violent non-state actors, epidemics are something that is regularly seen in the African continent. They've dealt with Ebola. It hasn't necessarily stopped wars, and it hasn't stopped violence from taking place at all. So there's an experience and a memory of epidemics on the continent, which I don't think is present in other places.
And as you mentioned earlier, also, I suppose the presence of MSF in the continent and their interaction with these non-state groups would in some way allow them or aid them versus other groups that don't have these long-term connections with Doctors Without Borders.
I think we're being very optimistic there. What MSF's capabilities are going to be faced with a major outbreak around the world, it's very limited. I think it's more a question of legitimacy and long-term healthcare than dealing with the epidemic itself.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Caroline. So that first question to Caroline was from Virginia Comolli. And we are on to our second question, which is for Jan. This is coming from Jack Morgan Jones. So Jack is asking, you mentioned plundering by extremist far-left groups, as well as coughing attacks by far-right extremists. Which examples are you thinking of, and which end of the political horseshoe will be more emboldened by this epidemic?
Very good question. Just before I answer it, I'd like to add just a couple of things to what my previous speakers have mentioned, which I agree with fully. In terms of the opportunity, I think it's important to mention that the bigger groups, they seek the publicity and things like that. That is important without a doubt. But I think what we've seen in very highly polarized campaigns, whether it's Brexit or the migration refugee crisis, that it creates an environment where a lot of overseen single actors that aren't directly linked to large organizations feel somehow compelled to act. And I think we're in the short term, we're going to see a lot of these actors, a lot along the same numbers that we're seeing right now with other topics still go on. And there's no doubt that long term, especially the weakening of the state and security apparatus will also be an opportunity. And in terms of African groups, I think it's very interesting to notice the contrast just last week between Burkina Faso and Mali. The JNIM in Mali did not hesitate to carry out attacks again because it was the elections on certain and some of the members of its faction attacks against politicians and certain targets, whereas Burkina Faso, especially the north and the east, that had seen a major upswing or surge in terms of attacks in recent weeks, basically it stopped the southwest region in Tillabéri in Niger. And those are more, as Caroline mentioned, the ISWAP areas. There's more of an awareness to it. And I think that plays a role as well. And finally, yes, it is an opportunity for these governments to create more disinformation, and not necessarily in terms of putting out fake information, but the framing about it is it all. I think we can discuss this later on. But to the question, finally, far right, for example, we've seen, well, there are enough idiots posting their own videos, uploading it where they're deliberately spitting, licking goods in stores, or filming themselves coughing at what they see as let's say a homosexual couple or black people. Most of those will come from the United States. We see from smaller towns we'll have some claims by far left groups saying, well, you know, we're using the opportunity to set fire to areas in parking lots where more cars will be burned because right now the intervention time isn't good. We're going to plunder certain stores that we see as being for the rich because there's nobody in them right now. It's an opportunity to act. So there have been examples, far left mostly in Europe, far right mostly in the US so far. But I think right now, just based on the current momentum, the far right is much more active, if you want to use that horseshoe. And I think in the long run, especially once the economic pressures are felt, we'll definitely see more of the far left reacting.
Okay, thank you, Jan. There are quite a few questions coming in. Thank you very much to our viewers for all of these. Let me just go on to question 3, which is for all panelists. And this is coming from Riccardo Mazzucchelli. So, would we have to expect an increase in local violence if the food chain is slowed down or even interrupted? And how would you see radical groups ensuring food accessibility? Very interesting question. So let me go to Mitchell, if you want to start off with this question. Or
I mean, I can only perhaps speak about it in a very specific way, which is in the use of food amongst the groups that I've just referred to, especially the Houthi. They've been plundering UN food program shipments to Yemen for months. There's been a let up in that, mostly because of the military operation in 2018 that opened up the ports in Al Hudaydah. But besides this, I mean, the Houthi approach to using food as a weapon, the weaponization of this food supply has not changed at all. So we should, again, not see what they're doing in hospitals and following the World Health Organization as them now accepting all UN rules. They're not at all. And so I think that this is one point. When it comes, for example, to if we look at it from in the Gulf, or if we go to the Gulf and we go to the case of Iran, I want to maybe put this as a big contrast in terms of food security, because the world economy is slowing down. There's going to be I don't think there's going to be a recession. I think we're going to be heading directly into a huge depression. And I think that what we've seen in all the Gulf countries is that the awareness of the fragility of the supply chain in relation to food is there. And so they are trying and investing a tremendous amount of resources now in ensuring the flow of food. So although most of the societies there have closed down because of the coronavirus, the governments across the board are doing whatever they can to ensure that their people can eat. It's the Middle East, the Gulf countries are food importing countries. They rely on food production outside. So if global supply chains are interrupted, they will be deeply vulnerable. And they know this, so they're taking precautions. Other places, I don't think are putting the same resources behind ensuring the flow of food and stabilizing the food markets there. You know, this is a kind of zakat, you know, like charity. And I think that the Gulf countries, at least the GCC countries, are on track. At least, all things being equal, they're on track to preserve the food.
Okay. Can I add something?
Yes, please, Peter. I was going to come to you, actually.
Yes, I mean, just very briefly, basically what we've seen over the past few years in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, but also across Africa, are of course situations of state breakdown. And the likelihood is that as a result of this crisis, this current crisis, we will see more situations of state breakdown. And what we know empirically, and what's been shown in study after study, is that if the state breaks down, then other actors are becoming empowered, alternative providers of services, or even ultimately alternative providers of food. And this is the hour for organized crime. This is the hour for radical groups who know how to navigate this environment. So if anything, I would expect this situation to be an opportunity for radical groups, for extremist groups, for organized crime groups as well, to prove that they can actually fulfill some of the functions that the state used to provide. And if the state doesn't deliver these services and these basic necessities, other groups and other entities will fill that vacuum, will fill that void.
Sorry, I'm mute. Thank you, Peter. All right, let me go on to question 4. Another one for all panelists, and this is by Elena Rigacci. Do you believe that there may be increased opportunity for peace negotiations with non-state actors at this time of crisis? Caroline, I'd like to go to you for this one.
I think even if there were an increased opportunity for peace negotiations, I would be very surprised if the different actors, specifically government actors and international organizations, were to grasp that opportunity. I think there's major distraction, too much noise, and as much as I'd like to be optimistic, I'm not sure that there'll be increased peace negotiations, even if there were an opportunity as such. However, I will link that back to the question on food right before. I mentioned earlier, I'm really concerned about the generational divide. I'm also hugely concerned about food chains, and specifically because of the locust plague in East Africa and the Middle East, in addition to the coronavirus crisis, which is affecting fruit picking and food picking in general around the world. I think there's going to definitely be food shortages, increase in prices, lack of economic opportunities, and much more hunger. And if you correlate that, I know there's a question later about financing for international organizations. They're going to suffer. Charities are already suffering. So access to food and financing of IOs is, they're correlated. Now, even traffickers and organized criminals are not going to be able to address that to the extent that it's going to be necessary. So I think if we're going to talk about peace negotiations, there's going to be a correlation with access to food, and perhaps that's where we can see a bridge between international organizations, peace negotiations, and a positive outcome. But even so, I'm actually much more pessimistic than the question.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute my microphone. Guys, by the way, if you want to bounce off of each other's answers, please feel free to just unmute and jump in. I'm going to go on to, Caroline mentioned this briefly. This is a question by, and apologies for probably not pronouncing this correctly, Georgi Popov. So, yes, okay. Do you believe that the main international organizations, as for example, UN, EU, NATO, and their peacekeeping and supporting missions could be severely affected by the upcoming crisis? And in which ways will that result in the areas where those missions are concentrated? So how are the countries where these international organizations, where they're stationed or where they operate, how will they be affected by how the virus is affecting these organizations? If anyone wants to jump in first, please.
I'm ready to jump in on this, and it does link to what Caroline was mentioning, is that I think, to answer that question specifically, there's going to be a larger focus, and we're seeing this with the border closings and different and other aspects on domestic policy in the months and the years to come. I think this will definitely have an impact in the level of investment, not just financially, but what people are willing to contribute to various operations. I think the fact that most countries will lessen the priority of foreign policy is definitely going to affect certain missions, certain international missions. I can definitely see some cutbacks there, because at some point it's all good, the financial aid, and it's great, but the pendulum will swing, unfortunately, back to the other end, and this is usually the first things that tend to be cut. It's usually these foreign missions try to reduce costs. So I think in the midterm, it's going to have a serious impact. And it does link to the local environment as well. The international organizations, like the governments in very specific conflict areas, already have these relationships with violent non-state actors. They're part of the environment. They're part of the, let's say, natural ecosystem, for lack of a better expression. They need to deal with that in various ways. Either they're integrated sometimes in the security apparatus. We're seeing that, by the way, in whether it's in Libya, in northern Niger, in other areas where these groups are actually enforcing the lockdown. And you can tell, and they're doing collaboration with NGOs, with other organizations. So I think we're going to see a lesser formal international involvement from governments, but we're going to see an increase in international cooperation on site from organizations that aren't necessarily linked to government.
Can I just add that, I mean, I've spoken to many people about this. In general terms, I think we're betting on which government collapses first once the dust of this coronavirus settles. I used to think that it would be in the UK, but I've changed my opinion. In Europe or in the Middle East or in Africa, I think that there will be serious repercussions from the mismanagement of this crisis. Of course, I spoke about Iran at length, but I mean, it's not the only place that you can foresee huge governmental demonstrations or anti-governmental demonstrations, because this was completely mismanaged. So all these opportunities that we have to, even in places that you have high tension between sub-state groups and government, anything that's going to happen now, as soon as this virus is overcome, I think we're going to be in a serious, acute global state of political crisis as a result.
All right, thank you, Mitchell. So we have a question coming in from Baghdad. This is from Jafar Al-Waeli. He's from the New York Times in Baghdad, and it's for Mitchell. Mitchell, do you think that the post-pandemic economic impact in Iran will eventually weaken Iran's support for its proxies in countries like Iraq, Yemen, and Syria?
Great question. Actually, you're kind of getting the stress test is already happening. We've seen Hezbollah members already traveling to Iran to help out with cleaning operations and enforcing lockdown where, flexible, but at the same time, flights have never stopped between Lebanon and Iran. But yeah, to answer your question, your specific question, I think that Iran will have probably the most acute challenge since the revolution after this dust settles. People have been left to die on the streets. The medical, the healthcare system has rotted. You have not a two-tier system, you have a one-tier system where regime loyalists get some degree of medical attention, and everybody is basically left on their own, to their own devices. I think that this will not only lead to a weakening of the the financing, because Iran is going to have to spend a lot of money in trying to rehabilitate its economy. It's going to have to spend a lot of money at home. But I think over a long period of time, this could be, we use this term a lot, but I think this could be Iran's Chernobyl moment. The moment where they lied to their people about the extent of the disease, the moment that the information of how much they've spent on other projects, on Houthi, on Hezbollah, on proxies in throughout the region, actually. I think that now is going to be the moment of reckoning. People, when they get healthy and when they're not afraid of the virus, are going to come out on the streets and really show this regime what they mean when they say straighten up. And I think the regime is terrified of that, which is why now you can almost see that they're waiting for the opportunity to come back and begin their repression all over again.
So do you think, Mitchell, that this virus could be a turning point for the regime in Iran, in the sense that the financial crisis in Iran has been going on for years now, and the resources, the regime was still sending resources to these other organizations throughout the region rather than investing in its own country. Do you feel like this virus might now just be the breaking point where they actually do need to turn towards their own people and start investing in their country? Or do you think they might just try and let the storm pass and hope for the best and keep investing in other countries throughout the region?
Well, the important thing to remember about, and I'll say it very slowly and deliberately, about the Islamic Republic of Iran, the thing to remember is that it's a theocracy. They expect a lot of their people to become martyrs for their larger cause. They have an ideology which allows people to be sacrificed. And so if part of the sacrifice of preserving the regime is that people die as martyrs, as shaheed for it, okay, they can deal with that. But I think that the people have had just about enough. Last year's major demonstrations against government mismanagement, before you had the epidemic, was already reaching a boiling point. People were tired of the repression, and now they're going to fight back. And I really deeply, I feel it also, I'm deeply, not suspicious is the wrong terminology, but I feel it deep inside me that the Iranian boiling point is now. They don't want they don't want a government that spends money on missiles for the Houthis and Hezbollah, to bomb a site or to attack a position or to participate in the war in Syria or to establish cells in Bahrain or in Saudi. They don't want that kind of country anymore. Or Iraq, you have 40 different militias that they support there. Some of them are competing against each other. That's not what Iranians want from Iran. And I think that this regime's days are numbered. And the reason for it, the last straw that broke the back is the coronavirus.
Let me go on to a question for Peter. This is a question from Zainab Behan. Peter, do you believe that this turmoil and crisis might be capable of triggering to internal, might be able to trigger internal conflicts similar to the Arab Springs that we saw, or the Arab Spring that we saw in 2011?
Yes, and I think that's pretty much what I was hinting at in my initial statement. I do think a lot of scenarios are conceivable. We have to understand that these sort of revolutionary situations typically happen when a lot of stuff is changing. And there's no doubt in my mind that in many countries, and I think at this point it's very hard to predict what countries in particularly will be strongly affected and what countries will be less affected, but that in many countries, the convulsions that are resulting in both economic and political terms from this virus it will be very severe, and that different types of actors will use the situation in order to capitalize. And this will be, I believe, will be particularly strongly felt in countries that already have the sort of divisions, sectarian divisions, ethnic divisions, religious divisions that have been affected by this in the past. Because of course, these sort of sectarian and ethnic actors have a ready-made formula to take advantage of this situation and then turn it into something else and turn it into a struggle for power. So I do think, unfortunately, that the next few years, even long after the virus will have been contained, will be very unstable years where various actors will take advantage of instability and turmoil and will try to position themselves in a way that that they are ready to take over power in their countries.
And are there any specific countries within the Middle East that you feel are more prone to be going down this road?
Well, it's very hard to predict that, because it's not only whether these countries are in economic trouble or whether there are ethnic divisions. It also depends, for example, how the governments themselves will respond to this, how the international community will respond to this. So it's hard, but I do think that you can already see that there are countries that even in a relatively benign economic situation like we had until the virus, were already struggling. Countries like Iraq, for example, but also various countries in North Africa, where we've had peaceful protests for many, many months, but where the situation is incredibly tense, and where any change of atmosphere, any change of the economic and political situation may actually trigger something that will be very hard to contain. So yes, I do foresee an extended period of instability like the Arab Spring, but without the optimism of the Arab Spring, at least initially.
Okay, that's interesting. The Arab Spring, but without the optimism. All right, question for Caroline. This is from, and again, apologies for my terrible pronunciation. This is from Loic Bisson. Organized crime groups enacted curfews and quarantine zones in Brazil and Mexico. Could this health crisis be an opportunity for non-state actors to build legitimacy as health and governments providers in the Sahel region?
I don't think that criminal groups are enacting these curfews and quarantines in order to build legitimacy. I think it's to safeguard their operations. And I think it would be the same motivation for any non-state actor who's trying to effectively replace the government or position themselves where the government fails. However, I think there's a high risk that they would lose legitimacy if they did not operate as such. So rather than build legitimacy, I think it's the opposite. If they don't respond, then they are no better than the government. Where they do respond, I'm not sure that it will make a very big difference in terms of governance, because they're responding in places where the state is already absent.
Okay. Another question, well, this one is also for all, but I'd like to ask Jan to answer this following one. This is interesting. Werner Hofs asks, what would be the gender impact of COVID-19 in terms of recruitments and activities, with women being more vulnerable to the economic consequences? So presumably, I'm assuming he means recruitments of women within possibly illegal organizations or non-state actor groups because of them being more vulnerable as a result of the financial situation.
Well, I think it depends only on the group's ideology or mentality, but also on the region. Caroline mentioned earlier the differences between ISWAP and Boko Haram. It's the women of Boko Haram will not see any difference in terms of recruitment or in terms of what their use is. We see with the far left, where they usually try to promote equality, and they're very gender aware, so that won't change much. And the far right, it will be contextual again. So I see more that the needs and the circumstances will dictate what type of recruitment is necessary, but that as long as it's possible, the gender issues will stay within their current frameworks.
Can I add something?
Please.
Because now we're talking about terrorism in the time of coronavirus. I just wanted to, and I think I have to say it, there's been across Europe as well, like a registered increase in some places of up to 80% of domestic abuse as a result of the quarantine and as a result of the social level pressures of coronavirus. I can only imagine how bad the situation will be in societies where sexual violence and violence against women is also socially more acceptable or socially acceptable. So I think it's also important to put it into a wider context that Europe is not at this point somehow better or an island of stability when it comes to gender-related issues, nor is the United States. So I think that all of these pressures need to also be discussed in a non, kind of terrorism or crisis space, but also in places that have experienced only democracy and open civil societies for decades, and we still have this huge upspike in violence against, especially violence against women, but gender-based violence. So just had to say it. So.
Absolutely, no, that's a great point. And I mean, staying on that topic, there was an interesting, I think it's interesting to mention also that in Iraq, for example, there have been reports of families in more traditional or more rural areas of the country that have refused to allow doctors, allegedly refused to allow doctors to visit their female relatives. So again, I mean, this is not necessarily physical abuse within the household or domestic violence, but it's still denying their female relatives the right to see a doctor in case they were showing signs of COVID-19. So definitely want to keep in mind going forward the role of women and their vulnerability within an already very vulnerable situation. All right, we have come almost to the end of our hour and a half with some really great points. I would like to take on one more question. And this is, okay, let's finish up with Walter Janssen, and this is for all speakers. How does the current COVID crisis prepare governments for any possible future attack where chemical or biological agents are used? Who would like to brace themselves and take this one on?
Can I respond to that, Sophia?
Please, go ahead.
So I think that one thing is for certain. I was having this discussion yesterday with someone else, even 5 years ago, when people were saying health security should be part of security. People were kind of laughing at that notion. It was not really considered to be a hard security topic. It was not considered to be something really as important as stuff related to terrorism or missiles or wars. And I think that will completely change. Intelligence agencies will hire epidemiologists and virologists as much as they will hire terrorism experts. And so our understanding of what threatens our security, what threatens our country, our well-being, the safety of our citizens will completely change as a result of that. And so in that sense, the answer to the question is, it will actually, in the long term, help us, because as a result of mainstreaming health as a security issue, the capabilities in security agencies to deal with issues like chemical, biological, or radiological materials will increase. This will be, front and center of all security agendas in every country in the world for years to come.
Can I add just, because I think Peter really summarized it perfectly. My thought is that I personally would have expected a better set of contingency plans. And I think, and I really have to say, I'm not ideological in this, but I think that neoliberalism in some countries and the selling off or the splitting of healthcare into private and public sectors, and then the reduction of public spending on public healthcare is also, now we see it at face value, how much damage it's done. We don't have our contingency plans. We didn't set up our field hospitals. We don't have enough supplies. So now half of Europe is running around the world trying to taking tenders from anybody who's selling masks. And that's only creating atmospheres of profiteering. There's organized crime groups affecting that here as well. So I think it's important, and to bring this into Wouter's question, we're ill prepared if this were a chemical or biological attack. I think that the inability of having a contingency plan on it's not slow moving, but a relatively slow moving compared to a biological chemical attack. A relatively slow moving crisis and not being able to get our grounding on it, our footing on it, can also be sending messages to people about our lack of preparedness in these kind of crisis situations.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up unless any of you have anything else to add regarding the last questions or anything else that we've touched upon today. And if not, I just want to thank you all very much. Thank you very much to the participants today who viewed us and who sent in their questions. A report and the recording of this webinar will be available on our website and on our channels. And Mitchell, please.
Can I feel as last word, not about the topic, but about the fact that because we've all been driven underground, so to speak, because of the quarantine, just to let our the remainder of our audience know that we're going to be doing these events probably every week. The next one will be at the same time in the same place on information warfare and about disinformation campaigns. So next week, if you would like to join us, we'll be sending out information about that session in the coming days. And then on the 14th of April, we'll be doing yet another event. So basically every week. So please stay tuned for our upcoming events. And we very much look forward, to having and to seeing all of you. And on behalf of the organizer, Sophia, first I would like to really give you a big round of applause. Thank you so much for your moderation today. It was great, and to all of our guests. So that's it from me. I'll go back to you, Sophia. It's up to you.
Thank you, Mitchell. Okay. Again, thank you very much to all 4 speakers. Thank you to our viewers. Caroline, Peter, Jan, and Mitchell. Thanks again, and have a good day wherever you are in the world.